"This cannot be war," Lieutenant Tanaka whispered, lowering his head, his hands trembling as he tasted the enemy's food. It was 1945, deep in Louisiana bayou country. The air was thick with cypress mist and the slow hum of summer insects. In the clearing near Camp Livingston, a circle of Japanese prisoners sat cross-legged beside a wide black kettle suspended over a wood fire. Inside, oil hissed and popped as catfish fillets turned golden brown. Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka sat among them, his face unreadable, his eyes sharp. Just 2 years earlier, he had flown with the Imperial Navy, a man who believed dying for the Emperor was the highest honor. Now he sat barefoot in American dirt, surrounded by men who smiled while guarding their enemies. To Tanaka, the smell of frying fish was unbearable. Not because he disliked it, but because it felt like a trick. Food this rich, this warm, could only be a trap. His stomach growled, but pride held him still. Across the fire, an old Cajun man stirred the pot with a wooden paddle. His sleeves were rolled up, his skin browned by the sun, his grin easy and wide. When he saw Tanaka watching, he lifted a slice of catfish on the paddle and said in slow, broken English, "Eat, son. Ain't poison, just supper." The guards chuckled softly. The Cajun man handed the first plate to Tanaka. The lieutenant hesitated. He could hear his instructors' voices echoing in memory. Never trust the enemy. Better to starve than submit. But hunger was stronger than pride. He raised the fork and took a single bite. The fish was soft and buttery, the crust crisp, the flavor smoky and unfamiliar, and something inside him broke. He lowered his head, set the fork down, and whispered in Japanese, "This cannot be war." The other POWs watched, uncertain, as Tanaka's hands began to tremble. The Cajun man didn't understand the words, but he understood the feeling. He poured a cup of sweet tea and placed it beside him. For a long time no one spoke. Only the sounds of frying oil, cicadas, and distant laughter from the guards filled the air. Then one of the American soldiers, a young man from Baton Rouge, said quietly, "You know my brother's fighting in your navy. Maybe he's hungry too." Tanaka looked up at him. There was no hate in the man's face, only tiredness. Real human tiredness, and for the first time since his capture, Tanaka realized these men were not monsters. They were just men who worked, sweated, and missed home the same as him. The old Cajun took a seat beside him and began to hum an old tune. The sound of the melody mingled with the crackle of the fire. The catfish kept frying. By the end of the meal, the Japanese prisoners were eating without fear. Some even smiled. Later, Tanaka would write in his diary, "They defeated us with food. And I think I understand why." He didn't mean the meal itself. He meant what it represented. In that moment, the Cajun and the captives were no longer enemies divided by oceans and ideology. They were just men sharing the simplest proof of peace, a warm meal in a quiet place. When the night came and the fire burned low, the lieutenant whispered a final line in Japanese so softly that no one heard. "They taught me something no general ever did. How to be human again." Before Louisiana, before the catfish and the Cajun, Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka had been taught one truth. Capture was worse than death. In the Imperial Navy, surrender was dishonor. At training academies in Yokosuka and Kure, officers drilled it into every young pilot. An American soldier would torture, humiliate, and erase your name from honor if you ever fell into his hands. Posters, films, and radio broadcasts turned that warning into dogma. The Americans have no souls. So when Tanaka's aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire over the Pacific and his parachute dropped into enemy waters, he was certain his life was already over. The first shock came when the Americans pulled him from the sea. They didn't beat him. They didn't spit or sneer. They wrapped him in a blanket and gave him water. One sailor even offered him a cigarette. Tanaka refused, not from pride, but from confusion. Captured prisoners from his unit whispered among themselves, terrified. "They'll starve us. They'll work us to death," another muttered. "They'll make us tell secrets and then shoot us." But the journey to the mainland proved different. Instead of chains, they were given rations. Instead of insults, they heard laughter. The ship's cook even apologized when the rice ran out. "Sorry, fellas," he said. "Guess we'll have to get creative." When they arrived in California, the Japanese POWs expected to see barbed wire and punishment. They found showers, medical tents, and American nurses treating their wounds. Tanaka couldn't understand it. He thought it must be some trick, a facade before interrogation. He kept silent, waiting for the cruelty to begin. But it never came. Instead, after processing, he was put on a train bound for Louisiana. The guards were relaxed, friendly even. They shared chocolate bars, pointed out passing towns, and told stories about their families. "Texas will be too hot for y'all," one joked. But Louisiana, that's real food country. The words meant nothing to Tanaka then. But when the train reached Camp Livingston, he began to sense something was different. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. The guards didn't shout. There were barracks, not cages. "Are you Ensign?" "Yes." Sergeant gathered the new arrivals and said, "You'll be treated fair here. You work, you eat, you rest. No one touches you. That's the rule." To a Japanese officer, that sounded like madness. How could an enemy speak of fairness at night? Tanaka lay on a clean cot, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above him. The sheets were soft, the silence was total. And for the first time in years he realized he wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of being wrong. Back home, his wife Emmy believed the Americans were beasts. His mother prayed he would die before capture. And yet here, the men who should have been monsters were offering him comfort. In his diary that week he wrote, "I have entered a land of contradictions. They defeat us in battle and feed us afterward. They should despise us. But they don't. Perhaps their strength is not in hatred, but in something far more dangerous, mercy." That single line would echo throughout the camp, whispered among prisoners who began to doubt the Empire's lies. For the first time, Tanaka began to ask himself a question his instructors never wanted him to ask. What if everything we believed about the enemy was a lie? By 1945, the United States held over 400,000 Axis prisoners of war. Germans, Italians and Japanese spread across more than 500 camps from California to Georgia. Louisiana alone held several thousand, tucked away among the pine forests and bayous. Camp Livingston was one of the largest, a patchwork of wooden barracks, mess halls, and work sheds surrounded by barbed wire that to many prisoners felt more like a farm than a fortress. Everything ran by the book, the Geneva Convention of 1929. It required humane treatment, equal food rations, medical care, and protection from violence. The United States followed those rules precisely. Some soldiers grumbled that their captives ate better than civilians back home. But the order came straight from Washington. We fight to preserve our values, not to betray them. The camp commander, Colonel Maxwell, Max Rhodes, made that clear the day Tanaka and his group arrived, standing before the assembled prisoners. His voice carried through the humid air. "You are soldiers," he said, "and soldiers are owed respect. You'll work, you'll live decent, and you'll go home when this war ends. That's America's promise." The Japanese prisoners exchanged uneasy glances. To them, the word respect had no place between enemies. In their world, defeat erased honor. In this one, it seemed to restore it. Each day followed a rhythm. The POWs rose at dawn to the sound of a bugle, lined up for roll call, and ate a breakfast of oatmeal, bread, and coffee food they hadn't tasted since before the war. Then they were marched to work details, cutting timber, repairing fences, helping on nearby farms. The Americans didn't bark orders. They gave instructions. The guards were often young boys from Kansas, Alabama, or Louisiana. They treated their captives with a kind of distant politeness, more curious than cruel. Some even learned bits of Japanese to give commands clearly. The strangest thing was the equality. The same food served to the guards appeared on the prisoners' plates. Fresh meat, vegetables, rice when available, and occasionally fruit. Even medical staff rotated between American soldiers and POWs without discrimination. For Tanaka, this was unthinkable. In the Japanese army, prisoners were beaten, starved, erased. Weakness was punished. Here, weakness was met with medicine. He watched one day as a young Japanese private collapsed from heat exhaustion during field work. An American sergeant sprinted to help, shouting for water, waving off other guards. Within minutes, a jeep from the camp infirmary arrived. The man was carried back, treated, and returned to full health within days. That evening, Tanaka sat at the edge of his bunk, staring at his tin cup. "We treat our enemies like dogs," he whispered to himself. "They treat theirs like brothers." Word spread through the camp. The Americans had saved a man's life instead of ending it. And something shifted. The prisoners began to follow orders, not from fear, but from a strange sense of gratitude. What most of them didn't know was that the humane treatment was not only moral, it was strategic. Washington believed that showing fairness would undermine Axis propaganda and give the Allies moral high ground for the post-war world. And it worked. Tanaka began to see it not as weakness, but as power. The kind of power that could rebuild a nation instead of destroying it. In his next diary entry he wrote, "They fight a war of decency, one that conquers not with bullets but with dignity." He didn't yet realize it, but the lesson was only beginning. The next chapter of his captivity and his transformation would come not from the guards or the officers, but from the ordinary people of Louisiana, people who didn't see prisoners, only men who were hungry. In the summer of 1945, when the war's end was a whisper on every radio, the numbers began to haunt Lieutenant Tanaka more than the barbed wire around him. He had spent months in Louisiana, long enough to see supply trucks come and go, to notice how efficiently the Americans managed even their prisoners. Everything was counted. Everything was provided. Nothing, not even his existence, was forgotten. The statistics reached him through camp newspapers and bulletin boards. They printed facts as casually as weather reports. Over 425,000 Axis prisoners now held in the U.S. Every P4 the My-2 W receives 3,000 calories per day. But S rations exceed Geneva standards. These numbers were supposed to be administrative, but to Tanaka, they sounded like a confession, proof of a strength Japan could never match. He remembered the stories from home, starving civilians trading rice for cloth, soldiers dying in the jungle for lack of quinine. Yet here in the enemy's land, even captured men were fed meat, bread, and coffee. He couldn't decide whether to be grateful or ashamed. During one meal, he counted the plates at his table. 12 men, 12 portions, not one short. He glanced toward the kitchen where American cooks, black and white, worked side by side in the heat, laughing, swearing, and passing each other trays. It was chaotic, but alive. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen that much energy directed toward feeding an enemy. Across the mess hall, a radio crackled. A unit waited. As Notley, news announcer, spoke of production figures. Tens of thousands of planes, millions of tons of steel, miles of rail track. Tanaka knew then that Japan's war had been lost, not on the battlefield, but in the factories. One night, while sweeping the barracks, he overheard two guards talking. "You know what's crazy?" one said. "We spend more feeding these fellas than Germany spent feeding their whole damn army." The other laughed. "Guess that's why we won, huh?" The words hit him like a blow. They spent more feeding their prisoners than we spent saving our soldiers. That night he wrote in his journal, "Our empire spoke of honor, of sacrifice, of death for the emperor. But these men speak of efficiency, of fairness, of life. Which is the greater power?" The next morning, he saw a truck arrive from a nearby town. Civilian volunteers, Cajun farmers and their families, had sent food to the camp: cornmeal, onions, fresh fish, even bottles of Coca-Cola. The guards joked that the locals had adopted the prisoners. Tanaka was stunned. He had believed kindness ended at the gun barrel, but here it extended past it into kitchens, fields, and small southern towns. Later that week, the camp newspaper published a single line that burned into his memory. "America spends $1.8 billion a year to house its enemies humanely." To him, that wasn't just a number. It was a moral equation. His people had spent everything on war and pride. The Americans spent billions on compassion. He closed his journal that night with a final thought. They fight with money. We fight with spirit, but spirit cannot fill a stomach, and hunger cannot win a war. The realization hollowed him, but it also lit a strange, reluctant respect. He began to see that America's strength was not cruelty disguised as mercy. It was conviction built from the belief that decency was part of victory itself. By late summer, Camp Livingston had settled into a strange rhythm, part military, part rural southern life. The guards were relaxed, the prisoners disciplined, and the air thick with humidity and pine. It was on one of those still, sunlit mornings that Lieutenant Tanaka and a small work detail were sent beyond the wire to help a nearby Cajun farmer repair storm damage to his barn. It was supposed to be routine labor, fence posts, hammers, and quiet supervision. But what happened that day would become camp legend. The farmer, a stout man named Baton Dubois, with weathered hands and a slow Louisiana drawl, didn't see prisoners. He saw workers. "Y'all hungry?" he asked through the guard, who translated awkwardly. The POWs hesitated. "Hungry?" Tanaka answered softly. Bate nodded. "Then we eat first." No man works on an empty stomach. He disappeared into his kitchen, and minutes later the smell hit them. Smoky, rich, impossible. Crawfish simmering in a giant iron pot, corn and potatoes bubbling beside it, and fat slices of sausage frying in bacon grease. To men raised on military rice and canned fish, it smelled like heaven and home and disbelief all at once. When the guards protested that prisoners weren't supposed to eat with civilians, Bate just waved a hand. "You shoot me if it's wrong," he said. "But I ain't feeding men through a fence." The Cajun's defiance silenced even the sergeant. They set up wooden tables beneath a pecan tree. The prisoners were seated first. Bate dumped steaming crawfish onto paper-covered boards, added corn, sausage, and thick slabs of bread. The POWs didn't move. They thought it was a trick that any moment someone would shout enough and drag them away. But Bate grinned, cracked a crawfish tail and said, "Come on, boys. Food don't bite." One prisoner crossed himself. Another whispered, "Americans feed us like guests." Tanaka picked up a piece of sausage, hesitated, then took a bite. The spice burned his tongue, but it wasn't pain. It was life. He looked around. Men who'd sworn to die for the emperor were now smiling, wiping sweat, laughing at the strange food. Even the guards couldn't help but join in. Someone brought out an old harmonica, and soon the yard filled with music, laughter, and the clatter of shells. That night, back in camp, Tanaka couldn't sleep. His diary entry was short, but heavy with emotion. "They fed us without fear. They let us taste freedom, and it burned hotter than war." Over the next weeks, that meal became legend. Inside the camp, POWs spoke of the Cajun as myth. Ordinary men who defied orders to show kindness. The command tried to discourage such interactions, but the story spread faster than any regulation could stop it. To the Japanese officers, it was the ultimate confusion. In their empire, mercy was weakness. Here, it was law. When word reached Colonel Rhodes, the camp commander, he didn't punish anyone. He simply said, "If feeding a man makes him remember his humanity, it's worth more than a dozen guards with guns." For Tanaka, the Cajun meal became the day he stopped being afraid. He'd been trained to see the enemy as demons, but now, staring at a plate of crawfish and sausage, he realized the truth. The Americans had already won, not because they were stronger, but because they refused to hate. The night after the Cajun meal, Camp Livingston was quieter than usual. The cicadas hummed in the Louisiana dark. The smell of boiled spice still lingered in the air, and the prisoners sat in silence, full, confused, and shaken in ways they couldn't name. Lieutenant Tanaka lay awake on his bunk, staring at the wooden ceiling. For the first time since capture, he wasn't thinking about escape. He was thinking about arithmetic, not of bullets and bodies, but of values. The numbers came to him in fragments, just as they had in the newspapers. 425,000 Axis prisoners, each with shelter, rations and care. America spent $1.8 billion keeping its enemies alive, more than his own country had spent feeding its soldiers. It didn't make sense. His government had glorified death, theirs invested in life. He thought of home, of the propaganda film showing Americans as beasts who tortured and mocked prisoners. He remembered the officers who screamed that capture was worse than death. Yet here he was, a man who'd lost the war and found food, dignity, even laughter. He couldn't sleep, so he stepped outside the barracks. The guards nodded but didn't stop him. One of them, a young Texan with freckles, offered a cigarette. They stood together, two silhouettes under the stars, saying nothing. The guard finally spoke. "You ever seen this many stars back home?" Tanaka shook his head. "No," he said quietly. Ours are hidden by smoke. The Texan smiled sadly. Yeah, ours were too once. It wasn't much of a conversation. But it was enough to make Tanaka's chest tighten. He realized that this young American had probably lost friends in the Pacific. And yet here he was, sharing silence instead of scorn. Back in his barracks, Tanaka opened his journal and began to write. They defeated us without hatred, without speeches, just with order, food, and quiet mercy. Over the next few days, the camp buzzed with rumors that Washington would soon start repatriating prisoners. Some men rejoiced, others dreaded it. Tanaka was among the latter. He no longer feared captivity. He feared returning home and being unable to explain what he'd seen. Because how could he? How could he describe cowboys who offered friendship, guards who smiled, civilians who cooked for them? How could he say that kindness had wounded him more deeply than bullets ever could? When Sunday came, the camp chaplain invited prisoners to attend a joint service. Americans on one side, POWs on the other. Tanaka sat in the back, head bowed, pretending to pray. But he wasn't praying, he was comparing. On one side, uniforms, discipline, victory. On the other, captivity, confusion, grace. And somehow the latter felt stronger. After the service, he watched a guard hand his canteen to a prisoner from another unit. The gesture was so simple, it felt sacred. In that moment, Tanaka finally understood the moral equation that had been haunting him for months. If power is measured by destruction, Japan had been mighty. But if power is measured by restraint, by decency, by the courage to show mercy, then America had built an empire of humanity. That realization broke him and healed him at once. That night he wrote his final entry of the month. We were taught to die for honor. They live for it, and that's why they will outlast us. He closed the notebook, placed it under his pillow, and for the first time in years, slept without fear. By early autumn of 1945, the war was over. But for the men of Camp Livingston, the conflict still lived inside their heads. The radio confirmed Japan's surrender. Flags changed, guards relaxed, but in the quiet Louisiana mornings, Lieutenant Tanaka still woke to the echo of air raid sirens that weren't there. That was when the letters began. For the first time, the U.S. government allowed Japanese POWs to send censored mail home. Short, factual, and heavily inspected, but the words that slipped past the red ink would tell a truth no propaganda could erase. Tanaka sat on his bunk, pen trembling in hand. How could he explain this world to his wife, Emmy, who still believed her husband was fighting for the emperor's eternal glory? How could he describe Cajun farmers who fed him, American guards who smiled, and a nation that treated its captives better than its enemies? He began carefully, writing as though afraid the words might explode. My beloved Emmy, I am safe. The Americans are strange people. They smile too easily. They treat us fairly. They let us work and read. I do not understand it. I have eaten food richer than I've ever known. It is difficult to hate a people who feed you. He hesitated, staring at the half-finished page. Then he added quietly, they are not devils, as we were told. They are men, perhaps better men than we were. When the censor's office passed the letter for review, the American officer, Captain Donnelly, read it twice, sighed, and approved it with a faint smile. Let it through, he said. Truth's a better weapon than ink. 2 weeks later, in war-torn Nagasaki, Emmy received the letter. She sat by a broken window, reading the page again and again. When she reached the line about kindness, she pressed it to her chest and wept. In the camp, Tanaka wasn't alone. All around him, other POWs wrote similar letters, each one a tiny rebellion against the lies they'd grown up believing. They wrote about food, about decency, about how their guards treated them as equals. One officer wrote, the Americans are powerful not because they hate, but because they don't. Another scribbled, they feed us meat and call us sir. Our empire taught us that respect was earned through fear. They earn it through fairness. Weeks later, news came that these letters, hundreds of them, had begun circulating quietly through Japan. Families copied them by hand, passing them from neighbor to neighbor, whispering that maybe the enemy wasn't what the radio said. By December, Japanese newspapers, desperate to censor foreign influence, issued warnings against rumors of benevolent captivity. But it was too late. The truth had spread like smoke, impossible to contain. Inside Camp Livingston, Tanaka received a reply from Emmy. It was short and shaky from tears. "You are safe? That is enough. But your words frighten me. If kindness is stronger than honor, what have we fought for?" He folded the letter and stared at it for a long time. Then he smiled faintly and said to himself, "We fought for something that no longer exists." That night, as he stood outside beneath the southern stars, he felt a strange peace settle over him. The guards no longer seemed like captors, and the barbed wire no longer looked like a cage. The Americans had built something he couldn't see but could feel, a world where mercy was power. And in a quiet Louisiana camp, one letter at a time, that idea was already winning the peace. Winter crept gently across Louisiana, the cypress trees standing bare over fog-draped bayous. Camp Livingston felt different now, less like a prison, more like a waiting room for lost men. News of repatriation spread through the barracks, and for the first time since capture, the Japanese POWs began to smile with something like hope. Then, one morning, a familiar sound carried through the camp gates, the rumble of a beat-up pickup truck. Tanaka looked up from his post and his breath caught. It was Baton Dubois, the Cajun farmer, the man who had defied orders, fed prisoners like guests, and changed everything. He stepped out of the truck carrying a brown paper bag and a grin that could disarm anyone. "Heard you might be heading home soon," he said, tipping his hat to the nearest guard. "Figured I'd bring a little something for the road." The guards didn't stop him. They just nodded, half amused, half reverent. Everyone in the camp knew about the Cajun meal. It had become legend. Bate walked up to the fence where Tanaka stood and held up the bag. "Ain't crawfish season," he said with a wink. "So I brought you something better." Inside were glass jars, homemade preserves sealed tight with twine. "Peach," Bate said. "Picked them myself. You boys deserve something sweet before you go." Tanaka couldn't speak. His throat locked up. For months, he'd replayed that first meeting, that impossible act of kindness. And now here the man was again, smiling like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. He reached through the fence, hesitated, then extended his hand. Bate didn't flinch. He shook it. Firm, steady, warm. The guards watched in silence. Even they seemed to understand that something larger than rules was happening. "War's a fool's business," Bate said softly. "But a man's got to remember. Fool or not, we still got to eat." Tanaka smiled. "You gave us food," he said in halting English, "but also you gave us peace." Bate scratched his chin. "Well," he said, "guess peace goes better with peaches." They both laughed awkwardly at first, then freely, the sound rolling across the camp like a hymn. For a brief moment, the war didn't exist. There were no victors, no prisoners, just two men standing between barbed wire and open fields, shaking hands in the middle of history. When Bate turned to leave, Tanaka called after him. "Why?" The Cajun paused. "Because my daddy said," he answered, "if you feed a man, he can't stay your enemy long." And then he was gone, the truck disappearing down the dusty Louisiana road, its tail lights fading like embers. That night, Tanaka placed one of the jars of preserves beside his cot. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. It wasn't the fruit that mattered. It was the gesture. In his final journal entry before repatriation, he wrote, "The enemy gave me food. The farmer gave me his hand. And somewhere between the two, I stopped being a soldier." When the war began, he'd sworn loyalty to an empire that glorified obedience. Now he was leaving with something far stronger, the knowledge that decency could cross every line, even those drawn by blood. Years later, when he told his grandchildren the story, they asked what America was like. He smiled and said, "America, it was a place where a farmer shared peaches with his enemy." The day finally came when the ships were ready to carry them home. Dozens of trucks lined up outside Camp Livingston, engines idling in the Louisiana heat. The prisoners filed out in columns carrying small duffel bags, wearing the same khaki uniforms they'd arrived in, only now faded from the sun and work. Lieutenant Tanaka stood among them, quiet, his cap in his hands. He looked around the camp, the guard towers, the mess hall, the barbed wire that had once looked like a cage, but now felt strangely protective. He realized with a shock that he would miss this place. Before boarding, each man was given a small meal. Bread, eggs, and a slice of ham. It was simple, but to men who had once fought for an empire built on hunger, it felt like a feast. "Are you where?" "Yes." Sergeant passed out the food and said, "No hard feelings, boys. War is over. Time to go home." As Tanaka took his tray, he looked up and asked, "Sergeant, why did you treat us this way?" The man shrugged. "Orders and maybe decency." Hard to tell the difference after a while. Tanaka smiled faintly. "In my country," he said, "orders and decency were never the same thing." The sergeant nodded. "Yeah, guess that's why you lost." The line moved on. No anger, no insult, just truth. When Tanaka sat down to eat, he noticed that no one was talking. Every prisoner seemed lost in thought. Some chewed slowly, others just stared at their plates. It wasn't shame that filled the room. It was something heavier, respect. Later, as the convoy rolled toward the port, Tanaka opened his journal for the last time. His handwriting, once rigid and formal, now flowed with quiet ease. They called them cowboys. "We called them fools, but it turns out the fools were us," he wrote. "They believed kindness could survive war. We believed war could erase kindness. We were wrong." He paused, then added, "The enemy became our teacher, not with speeches or sermons, but with food, with patience, with hands that never struck us. They did not win because they were stronger. They won because they were human." As the trucks passed a small Louisiana town, children waved American flags along the roadside. A few POWs flew lice. WS raised their hands awkwardly to wave back. Tanaka did too. It wasn't surrender anymore. It was gratitude. When they reached the port, he saw the ocean for the first time in years. It shimmered under the late afternoon sun, calm and endless. He thought of his wife, his home, and the letters that had already crossed this same ocean, carrying the truth he could never unsee. Before boarding, an officer gave each prisoner a small ration bag for the journey. Water, bread, and a tin of peaches. The same peaches Bate had brought to the camp weeks before. Tanaka smiled, knowing it wasn't coincidence. It was continuity. As the ship pulled away, he stood at the railing and whispered to himself, "They defeated us with mercy, and that is the only victory that lasts." Years later, when journalists asked him what he remembered most about America, he didn't speak of airplanes or tanks. He said, "A farmer with peaches, a soldier with a cigarette, and a country that believed even its enemies deserved breakfast." When the ship docked in Yokohama weeks later, Tanaka stepped onto the ruined soil of Japan. Bombed cities stretched to the horizon. The smell of ash clung to the air. He was home, but it didn't feel like victory or defeat. It felt like awakening. In his final journal entry, he wrote, "They treated us like men, not monsters. They showed us that mercy can rebuild faster than any army can destroy. If Japan ever rises again, it must be with compassion, not conquest." Years later, Tanaka would tell his students, because he became a teacher, not a soldier, that the real battlefield of the 20th century wasn't Europe or the Pacific. It was inside the human heart. "The Americans taught me," he would say, "that kindness is a weapon more powerful than hate. And the men who fed their enemies, those were the true victors of the war." The screen fades on that line, the sound of ocean waves still rolling. "They defeated us without hatred," he says in voiceover. "And because of that, I could finally stop hating."